All right, everybody, let's go ahead and get started. So once again, my name is Kevin Hancock, Director of Solutions here at Exostar, and thanks for joining me and our partner RSM for today's webinar, Supply Chain Risk Management, Managing Flowdown Requirements Across Your Supply Chain. So for today's session, I'm joined by Amy Feldman and Kia Smith of RSM. I'm going to have them introduce themselves when they cut into their section. And before I dive into the presentation itself, just a few housekeeping details. So today's session is scheduled to last 45 minutes to an hour. That does include Q&A. Now, you're going to be muted during today's presentation, but you can submit questions via the chat feature or the Q&A. I'll take a look at both. We've also had some questions submitted prior to today's session when you signed up. If for some reason we do have an outage, just wait for a minute and try to reconnect. You can also just go back to the invitation you received and click on the link again and come into the meeting in that manner as well. If you'd like to speak with one of our CMMC experts, or if you have any additional questions, you can reach out to us a couple of different ways. You can email us at cmmc-team@exostar.com, or you can come to our website, www.exostar.com. There's a chat feature there on every page, and we'd be more than happy to answer your questions that way as well. Now, if one of your questions is, will I receive a copy of the slide deck? The answer is yes. Everybody who registered for today's session will receive both a copy of the presentation slides as well as a link to a recording of today's session. All right, with that, let me dive into the agenda. This is what we're going to cover today. You're only going to hear me for a little bit more, just to give a recap of kind of where we are in the current CMMC 2.0 rulemaking process. Then I'll turn it over to Key and Amy to talk about the main subject for today. We'll do a quick wrap up, and then we'll dive into the question and answer session. So where we are in the current process. So the CMMC ruling, the first phase of it, went into effect in 12/16/2024, when 32 CFR went into the Code of Federal Regulations. What this put in place was the CMMC program. And what that means is the documentation, the ability to start scheduling the third-party assessments, those kinds of activities can now start to take place. The thing that hasn't yet happened is it hasn't yet started to appear in federal contracting. That'll happen when 48 CFR goes into effect. So you can start to get your certification. You can start to ensure you're compliant with that, but you're not yet going to see it in contracts. Now, hopefully, as everyone now knows, the major difference with CMMC and current DFARS requirements is that with CMMC, you'll now move from just a self-assessment and self-attestation model to, if you do receive controlled unclassified information, you'll most likely be required to have a certified third-party assessment organization certify that you are in compliance with the NIST 800-171 controls. It also defines some further rules and regulations around cloud service providers and external service providers, and provided some more information around those kinds of services you may consume to meet the requirements. Now, just to recap, right? Hopefully everyone knows there are now 3 levels of CMMC. Level 1, which is what most people fall under, there are 15 requirements, and they are an annual self-assessment and an annual affirmation. Level 2 is for those organizations who receive or create controlled unclassified information in accordance with their contracts. Those folks are where you start to see the requirement for that third-party assessment. Now, there are some level 2 which will be okayed for a self-assessment, but that'll be driven by the contracting officer. And it'll be in the contracts itself. So when you see the contracts in which you're bidding upon, they'll determine which level you need to be at. And then level 3, small number of organizations, less than 1%. But for those organizations, it's a larger number of controls that you have to satisfy. It's the 110 from 871, just like level 2, but there are 24 additional controls you'll have to satisfy. Now, when CMMC does take effect, so when 48 CFR goes into effect, there is going to be a phased-in approach. When that does take effect, that first phase is expected to last a year. And that phase is really kind of where we are today, where it'll be a self-assessment for level 1 and level 2. Next phase, after that first initial 12 months, that's when you'll start to see the level 2 certification requirements start to be inserted into contracts. Phase 3 is when you'll start to see those level 3 certifications go in, and then full implementation after the first 3 years. Now, please keep in mind kind of that last bar that you see at the bottom of the slide. Well, full implementation will be after that 36 months. However, keep in mind that in some procurements, the DoD may implement these requirements a little early. All right. Okay, so that's kind of level set everybody where CMMC is coming into play. But the last thing, just to remind everybody, is that most likely you do have requirements today, right? There have been DFARS clauses that affect controlled unclassified information in contracts for a number of years now. If you have those clauses in your contracts, you do need to be compliant with NIST 800-171 if you have controlled unclassified information. If your contracts include the 7012 clause, that's the one that basically says that. If you've got the 7019 clause, you're also required to do a self-assessment and score yourself. That self-assessment is done in accordance with the assessment guide. That's the 171 alpha that you see up there. And you've got to report that score into the SPRS system of the DoD. Now, the SPRS system, Supplier Performance Risk System, is just a DoD application that is one, and your score for cybersecurity compliance is one of the factors that's used by the bid and contracting officers to determine, if you will, their acceptance of bids, awards of bids, etc. And your score and this measure are one of the things that go into your overall supplier performance risk. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kia and Amy to give you really what you came here for today. So Kia and Amy, take it away.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I'll jump in. Glad to be with everyone today to talk about what we think is an important concept to really understand, grasp, and fully digest when participating or being held to CMMC. My name is Kia Smith. I'm a director here, and I help lead our federal cyber compliance practice, where as a C3PAO in the space, we work with organizations in the DIV to help them get ready to manage and even maintain their CMMC environment. And I'm very happy to have our subject matter expert and a colleague of mine, Amy Feldman, who I'll let introduce herself in a moment, to really kind of help us dive down and think through what are some successful key concepts to keep in mind when building out that program. Amy.
Perfect. Thanks, Kia. Very happy to be here. Amy Feldman. I am a director here in our cyber risk and data protection practice. I've been a cybersecurity professional for around 13 years, but my real passion is in third-party risk management and supplier risk management. I work with a lot of our clients to help assess the current state of their program and the maturity of the controls that have been put in place to protect the exchange of information with your third parties. But we also help clients with building out and maturing their existing programs. So we often are brought in to take a look at policies and procedures and ensure that they align with the regulatory guidance. So CMMC falls directly within those types of updates. And we also look at things like procedural development and scaling the program. So we'll talk through some of those items today in terms of what makes an efficient program. We'll start with Kia. She's going to just give us some foundational information about supplier risk management in the CMMC rule and really what those flow down requirements say and mean. And then we'll dive into what you can do about building an effective supplier risk management program to align to those requirements. We have saved some time at the end for questions, but as Kevin mentioned, feel free to drop those in the chat and we'll try to answer those as well.
So supplier risk management is really a key and central concept, right, to CMMC. At its core, the purpose of DoD implementing CMMC as a certification process was really to ensure that everyone in the defense industrial base was assessing, validating, and paying attention to those parties that they are sharing that controlled unclassified information to. When you think about the supply chain, really the cybersecurity and the security of that supply chain is only as strong as the weakest link. So really, when we start thinking about building out a comprehensive supply risk management program and monitoring our vendors in accordance with CMMC, we need to make sure that we are taking into consideration how, where, and what we're partnering with these organizations to provide. DoD has recognized that OSCs are going to continue, right, to have reliance on third parties just as a way of business. That's how the world works these days with outsourcing functions to those that have efficiencies or maybe have tools to help get through day-to-day business functions. That is something that should augment business, but shouldn't expose the security compliance requirements around that. So as we go through a little bit, we'll talk in some practical terms about how OSCs can identify kind of those vendors or those folks that fall within their own supply chain. And then we'll think through some of those risk considerations. And as Amy said, we'll talk about what that looks like as a program. Let's go to the next one, please, Amy. So really when we start, we want to start with understanding your boundary. And no matter where you are in the process or your journey for CMMC, your boundary and your data flow is going to be an integral part of not only your assessment, but managing, maintaining, and understanding what's your scope of compliance liability. So when you start to think through for CMMC purposes, and you're really trying to identify who are those suppliers or those vendors that fall in your flow down, you need to understand whom you're interacting with this controlled unclassified information. And one of the key and central activities you can do is really start with your data flow. So most organizations will do this at the beginning just to make sure that they're scoping their assessment. It is a key step in really going toward certification, making sure you're identifying all the places in your environment that is receiving CUI and storing CUI. But then as we start to think about your supply chain, who are you sharing that CUI with? Those vendors then become those that you'll want to pay close attention to make sure that you understand their cybersecurity posture and their security practices, as well as ensuring that they are rising to meet a level that you find acceptable and tolerable in your environment in terms of how they're handling that CUI and who is actually handling that CUI. When we think about flow downs, oftentimes, and even when we start, most organizations can clearly identify what has been flowed down to them via the DFARS contracts. So DFARS contract clauses. However, today we really want organizations, and one thing that we encourage organization is understanding that organization's partners. So again, as we talk about your first activity of really trying to identify your boundary, we've received CUI from an organization. We may be doing things with it in our boundary, but who is the second parties or maybe even third parties in our CUI boundary that is touching that. And we have some examples here of where sometimes CUI will start to pop up. And some of them are areas that aren't necessarily intuitive because they might not be a discrete CUI asset, meaning it may not be something that you're using to actually deliver the service that the CUI is responsible for or is created within. But when you start to really do that data flow and depict it and analyze it, you will realize that you have quite a few different third parties or providers that may be coming unawareingly exposed to CUI. And so then really is where your strong supply chain or strong risk management processes come into play. Have you identified what they're doing and why they're doing it? Have you validated that those third parties or service providers, or as Amy will talk about, those nth providers or all the way down, should they really even be receiving the information? Are there opportunities for you maybe to reduce your boundary? Are there opportunities for you to prevent displaying or sharing that information? The more you are sharing that CUI with these subcontractors, service providers, and then even nth providers, the more you as an OSC become on the hook, so to speak, to making sure that they are operating and maintaining a cyber posture that's not only in alignment with your expectations, but ultimately stays in alignment with 800-171. So having a really clear understanding of who your partners are and why you're partnering with them and what they're doing is going to be a key concept in really not only limiting the scope of your compliance liability, but also making sure that your third-party risk and your supplier risk program is robust enough to capture all of those different partners. When we start to think about those partners, growing that even more, once you have defined them or identified them via your data flow, and then you started to really map them to understand where they fall in the flow down, the next thing you'll want to consider or really think about are what are the shared responsibilities or the risks that come with partnering with them. Having a clear understanding of what they are doing versus what you are doing and how that relates to the controls that ultimately you as the OSC must attest to via a certification or a self-assessment. So when you think through some of these things, some of the top key issues that we see probably, and I think I even saw some things pop up in the chat, is inconsistent identification and labeling of CUI. If there's anything else that makes this piece of CMMC the most challenging, that's probably the number one, right? Most OSCs will say, we don't even know if we're getting CUI. We have these clauses in our contract. Nothing we get is labeled CUI. No one says the word CUI. However, we need to comply with the rules and we need to treat things as CUI. So how do we deal with that, right? So some of it is you as the OSC have to take it upon yourself to make sure that you're talking with those contract officers or whomever is flowing that information down to you to clearly identify what am I receiving that is CUI. And then, as we discussed, you need to flow that through your environment. Okay, I have identified these 3 pieces of information that I get is CUI, and it's going all of these places in my environment, and it's interacting with these 5 vendors or subcontractors or whomever it is. And once you've clearly identified and flowed to from whom you're receiving and where you're sharing it, then you can really begin to apply your program and analysis around that vendor and how you're interacting with them. Another thing that often will come up a lot of times when thinking about risk, and I won't go through all of them, these slides will be made available to you all to keep in mind, is there's a lot of times a lack of alignment in sometime governance and analytics within your own environment. So oftentimes different pieces of CUI might be shared with different pieces of your environment. And without a centralized tool that's really kind of helping you manage and think through those partnerships, think through whom you're contracting with, taking into consideration some of these regulatory and risk considerations before you engage in a business relationship, it can often be somewhat daunting to get a handle on the full scope of your vendors and your subcontractors in your environment. I will say oftentimes when we start an assessment, a readiness, and we're working with OSCs, we'll say, let us have a list of your, send us your repository of suppliers and vendors. And often there's a lot of blank stares because there isn't a centralized list across the environment. Well, Amy's going to talk to you a little bit about how you can get a handle on maybe identifying and then managing and maintaining that list. But understanding that is also going to be critical when you really start to think about building out a very robust vendor management and supplier risk management program. Go to the next one. And so lastly, before I turn it over to Amy to really get into the meat of how to help you think about building out a robust program, is just some key compliance considerations, right? Your flow down requirements, as Kevin has mentioned before, while 21 may not be in all in contracts today, 12, 19, and 20 are, and they have been. And at the core of it, DoD expects organizations that they are partnering with to not only understand how they are maintaining CUI in their environment, but how all of their partners are. So you want to make sure that as you're seeing these and as you are taking on new partners to help you deliver pieces of your business, that you're keeping that front of mind, that these requirements and the ability to be able to demonstrate understanding these requirements or have been around and you have been subjected to them. CMMC is really just kind of the enforcement mechanism for what DoD expects to be common practice in cybersecurity. Another thing to keep in mind is with the finalization of CMMC as a law is really DoD wanting organizations to be able to demonstrate processes and abilities, right? Self-attestation, while it's still around, there is an increase with level 2 and especially when level 3 comes out. There's an increased reliance or increased expectation for evidence. Do you have actual repeatable processes for how every time you are interacting, processing, and doing things with the CUI, how you're protecting it? And really that's what the heart of the goal of today is, to kind of give you some best practices to really start demonstrating how you are not only monitoring and managing, but what's your program around your supplier and your risk compliance chain. And then the last part is monitoring and ongoing compliance, right? CMMC, while you will get that certification and is valid for 3 years, DoD fully expects, and really the intent is to have ongoing monitoring. And that applies also to your suppliers. Are you interacting and engaging with vendors and suppliers and then kind of forgetting they're there? Or do you have a robust process where you're constantly validating and ensuring that these organizations maintain and an appropriate level of cybersecurity posture for you to continue to share and or receive that CUI in a way that 171 and CMMC ultimately expects? And so I'll turn it over to Amy to kind of help you think through some ways you can really build out a robust program to help you do just that.
Perfect. Well, my brain thinks very methodically. And so sometimes I like to start from the end and work myself backwards. And so we're going to start with why supplier risk management programs fail. Because a lot of people struggle in this area. And I think by far the number one area is just lack of ownership and lack of really a strategy for governance. Somebody has to own the risk. And when nobody is identified, then nobody owns the risk. And it's okay to have a decentralized model of responsibility, but there still needs to be clear roles and responsibilities. So we'll talk through that a little bit more here in a minute. Number 2 is ignoring suppliers with smaller spend. I hear this a lot on the commercial side, but I think it applies as much here too when we think about the CMMC world, that we have specific requirements that are mandating what we need to do and whom we need to do that for. And so really letting your focus drift from your core boundary is like right off the bat a failure point. Number 3 is failure to align with resilience efforts. So yes, we're driving to the flow down requirements, but also important is understanding if these suppliers are critical to your business operation. So are they providing a critical business activity for you? And are you aligning your supplier risk management principles with your business continuity or operational resilience procedures? Number 4 is lack of risk classification tiering. And I think this is probably the biggest area that if you took one thing away from today's call, I would tell you to really dive into your risk tiering and your classification. You can't boil the ocean. And a lot of people are probably thinking, how do I wrap my head around this, especially with the flow down requirements? It seems like it could be, taken down to the 20th party. And so really trying to tier these and prioritize them is going to give you the most bang for the buck. Inconsistent follow-up with suppliers and really risk remediation and tracking as a whole. Organizations tend to do an okay job of completing some sort of risk assessment or due diligence, reviewing the controls up front, but then they often don't finish it out. Or they'll say, hey, we identified some issues, we'd like you to remediate them, and then it just kind of stops there. So failure to close the remediation loop is an area that I see organizations struggle. Number 6, insufficient or outdated contractual terms, where we maybe have been using the same supplier year after year. I know a lot of people rely on specific suppliers for specific needs, but really important that we're going back and we're updating those contractual terms and we're having legal review those. Number 7 is lack of performance monitoring and SLA management. And again, we do a good job up front. We don't always do a good job on an ongoing basis of maintaining the same level of risk management procedures that we do upon onboarding. Number 8, reliance on a point-in-time assessment. So again, we did one assessment up front, but what are we doing on a day-to-day basis to ensure that we are understanding the risk posture of our suppliers and understanding how that could affect your organization? Number 9, improper termination. So we've onboarded them and the vendors provided us with the service. Maybe you no longer need that service. Have you gone back and ensured that their access was revoked? Did we receive some sort of certificate of destruction? Do we have an offboarding checklist? All places that I see organizations struggle. And then lastly is failure to use technology. We just live in a world where we have so many suppliers and our inventories are so lengthy that while not mandated by CMMC and the rule, technology definitely plays a part in making our programs work smarter for us and run a little bit more efficiently. So taking all of that into consideration, what can you do to build an effective supplier risk management program? Really, there are 5 steps and 6 if you layer governance over the top. But if you look here on the right-hand side of your screen, you should see planning, due diligence, contracting, ongoing monitoring, and termination. I really like to think operationally when building out these programs, almost like a checklist, so that you can ensure that you're putting the proper protocols in place at each phase of the life cycle and that we're not missing any. But at its core, 4 big takeaways. Number 1 is governance and oversight. I hit on that briefly previously, but identifying someone, some group, some function to really own supplier risk management. Number 2 is taking a risk-based approach that really takes into consideration your full ecosystem. I think Kia's slide with the diagram of the boundaries and the flow down requirements really paints a great visual of thinking through who your supply chain extends to, so that by the time you get to the next one, which is a solid risk assessment methodology, you know who to apply that risk assessment methodology to. And then lastly is the use of tools to help manage the program. So let's dive in here. Defining ownership. By far, the number 1 question I get asked day to day is who should own supplier risk management? And there isn't, unfortunately, a right or wrong answer. Across any industry and across any regulation, what I see time and time again is the words, take a risk-based approach, which everybody tends to roll their eyes at because what does that mean? It's okay if you have a decentralized model for management of this program. And when I say decentralized, I mean that you don't have one single person who's responsible for it all. So oftentimes we have some sort of a relationship manager or somebody within the business unit who is the one who needs to do work with this particular supplier. They often hold the relationship with the actual vendor. So they're important. We often have somebody from procurement who is important. They are often ensuring that we get all the necessary administrative paperwork taken care of, and that we update the inventory. Maybe you have somebody from risk management or playing a risk management role who's responsible for completing some of the assessments. You have somebody in legal who's reviewing the contract. So you can quickly see how the org chart is expanding. That's okay. But really what you need is somebody who's going to say that you have responsibility for owning the risk and ensuring that the risk is mitigated or remediated at the end of the day. Oftentimes I see people put a steering committee in place for this, where there's not maybe a risk management function that can really take ownership of that, or having some sort of a charter that really outlines in a RACI chart who's responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. The second component of effective governance is really your administrative controls. These are your policies and procedures. And as Kia alluded to, really wanting to make sure that you can show tangible evidence that you have a well thought out program that is all encompassing of risk management components. So ensuring that you have your policies very clearly laid out, and that the scope is very clear as well. You want to delineate where you maybe have commercial suppliers and those that are accessing CUI. And maybe the policies look different. That's okay. We just need to make sure that they're very prescriptive. Similarly with your procedures, they should be an outlined, written playbook. Somebody should be able to pick that up and know exactly who's supposed to do what and what they're going to do with that information. Third, here's the risk matrix, defining inherent risk. I really like to delineate inherent versus residual risk. Inherent risk being the risk of doing business with this supplier, lack of any controls that they might have in place. Automatically, if they're handling your CUI, they're probably placed in some sort of an inherent risk, a high risk tier, but defining those tiers are critically important because it will help you to prioritize. You can also further break down the tiers. So many times people say ours are high, medium, and low, but you could have maybe a high moderate or a moderate low and have further definitions built in that might help you to delineate the due diligence that might need to be completed for that particular type of supplier. And then you'll do your due diligence as we talked through the process here on the right-hand side. And at the end of that risk assessment, you'll have enough information to really score the residual risk of the supplier. So that's the risk that's left over after we've applied all of their security controls over to the scope in alignment with your risk appetite. That residual risk can really drive your ongoing monitoring. So it's a combination of inherent and residual risk. And then lastly here is that inventory, and Kia hit on this as well, but being able to pull up a list of all of your suppliers, but also very clearly knowing what type of access to data do they have? How is the data flowing? Do we have some sort of a flow chart that you can attach with that? And really having everything centralized and bundled into that inventory so that you're very clear on your shared responsibilities matrix. You know your responsibilities and what the vendor is supposed to be doing or the supplier. And that way, when you get to the ongoing monitoring phase, you're not having to go back and look at your contract and re-review it every single time. You can build out your inventory as such that it almost works as a checklist for you in terms of the responsibilities that you need to maintain. So the second component that we talked about was really considering the full ecosystem. And in the industry, we call this nth parties because we know now that it's not just about your third parties, and it's really not just even about your fourth parties anymore. The ecosystem has grown And we're more dependent on service providers now than ever. I feel like every day I hear of another service being offered as a service or a managed service. And so quickly your ecosystem will grow. So a couple just tips here on the right-hand side for you. One is create that inventory and map your fourth party. So we talked about the inventory on the last slide. That's really with your suppliers, but understanding their dependencies. So ask them. Include this in your due diligence and in your risk assessment. Are you dependent on a third party to provide services to us? Will that third party have access to CUI? Ask the questions. If you are collecting a SOC 2 Type 2 report, for example, or some other sort of independent verification, oftentimes they list out the subservice organization. So pay attention to that and then map that into your inventory so that you're able to really understand number 3 on this list, which is concentration risk. So do you have dependencies on the same fourth parties or the same flow down? That's another element of risk management. But if there was a supply chain disruption or geopolitical tensions that we're experiencing now, do you have an understanding of how that might have some sort of impact to delivering your service to your end customer? Back to number 2, understanding their access. So will they have access to your network? Will they have access to your data? How will they have access to that? Are they going to interface with any of your customer base? And really making sure that that is outlined in your inventory. And then lastly is understanding the supplier risk management program that your third parties have in place. So another question that you can ask them about how they're managing their suppliers. So risk assessments, and again, if we go back to this 5-phased approach with planning and due diligence, the due diligence element and then ongoing monitoring is really where those risk assessments come into place. So one is confirming your supplier compliance to CMMC requirements. Ask them for their attestations, understanding your boundary, putting that in your inventory, and then again, it's a checklist. You need to provide us with that. Or sending some sort of risk assessment directly to them. Oftentimes we see this in the form of a questionnaire, and those questionnaires can look different depending on your risk tier and on the flow down requirement. So that's why it's critically important to establish those risk tiers up front and establish the framework and the risk assessment methodology that will be utilized to understand how your suppliers are meeting those controls. Once they return their responses to you, it should not be a yes, no, check the box exercise. This is really about managing risk. I often joke that risk isn't a bad word. It's all about what we do with that risk. And so understanding what you're looking at when you receive the information back, but then also tracking through remediation. So you can identify, a couple of issues within controls where you might say, this doesn't align to the risk appetite of our organization. And as part of our flow down requirements and as part of how we're maintaining CUI, we would really like you to go back and do X, Y, and Z. That's okay. I found that conversation actually strengthens relationships with your partners and can actually really lead to a long-term success because you're in turn helping them make their program more secure as well. And then lastly here, driving efficiencies with technology. We're in an environment now where it feels like we are just getting things thrown at us every day. And I know that this is not everyone's day job for most of you. And so work smarter, not harder where you can. Technology now can automate activities for you, whether that is automating deployment of the questionnaires, whether that is providing some sort of machine learning to review the responses, sending out like notifications to you via email to let you know that it's time for something. It increases the consistency, so we're reducing manual effort and we're really streamlining everything into one platform. Becomes critically important when you are operating in a decentralized model or you have multiple people who may be contributing to the management of the program. having a single pane of glass to review all of the risk management components and really review the ongoing monitoring of that particular supplier becomes so much easier in technology. I have listed out a few items here, things to look for if you're looking for technology. One is questionnaire templates. Take advantage of all the great work that our partners have done in this space. Many of them have aligned questionnaires to the CMMC level, and they do allow for customization. So take advantage of that. You don't have to recreate the wheel. Customize your risk rating, so ensuring that your risk fields do align to your risk tiering. So we talked today about the inherent versus residual risk, and you really want to make sure that you're able to track those seamlessly in technology. And lastly is the nth party tracking. This can become so helpful, mapping in all of those fourth parties and those flow down requirements, and treating it more like a process flow diagram, and really making sure that you're able to track those sufficiently. So just a quick recap today. Establishing your boundary is where we should start, right? Understanding where that CUI is flowing, understanding number two, the suppliers that are supporting you within that boundary. So whether it's prime, subcontractor, or nth party, and what requirements they have, so that you can make sure that you are maintaining those. Updating your contractual language. I really recommend that you look at this annually, work with your legal teams to ensure that the appropriate language is included. Wrap this into your ongoing monitoring as well, where you're taking a look at the contract year over year and just ensuring that it's up to date with where it needs to be. Review your suppliers. So really look at the control landscape across the ecosystem. Trust but verify here. So we're asking for those attestations. We're asking for evidence of controls, so that you have a good understanding that your supply chain is secure. Continuously monitor. I cannot enforce this enough. It is not a one-time assessment. It is really a day-to-day continuous monitoring of these suppliers, so that whether it's negative news, whether it's something that pops up on the deep and dark web, maybe as a cyber threat, maybe there are hackers that are talking about your organization in on deep web forums, like that is all important to track on an ongoing basis. And then lastly is just substantiate your process. Make sure that you are aligning to the C3PAO requirements, or that you're working with the C3PAO, and that you're really aligning where you should be in your supply chain. Before we open it up for questions, I always like to leave people with this, that you can outsource services, but you can't outsource the risk. And that's really what this is all about. It's not about being the land of no, but more so being a place where people know that you are truly looking out for the best interests of the organization. Kevin and Kia, I know that we had some questions come through.
Yeah, let me share out again.
Perfect.
And I will take over here. Make sure I'm on the same place Amy left off of. All right. So before I dive into the questions, I do want to just post a poll up. Would appreciate everybody's feedback. This is really just about how we did today. Also, it'll ask you about maybe you want a particular topic covered in a future webinar, but we'd appreciate any feedback you have. Also, if you are on your CMMC journey, Exostar has a number of solutions around the various steps of part of that process. We also do offer a supplier management application as well that's not on this, which addresses this, how do I gather risk around my different, from my supply chain. It has pre-populated, or not pre-populated, but standard questionnaires, one around NIST 800-171, also a standard questionnaire called the CCRA form that was developed by NDISAC to send out. It also does have the ability to customize information as well, or take one of those forms, add additional information, etc. So have a full suite of applications available for you, depending where, no matter where you are in that CMMC journey. So we did get some questions submitted prior to today's session. So I'm going to ask these of Kia and Amy, but I think most of these will go to Kia, but feel free to jump in, Amy, at any time. So number one, since there are so many manufacturers that provide products for DoD, what is the expectation of all of them gaining full compliance within that kind of 3-year timeline?
So this is an interesting question. And I mean, if I had a crystal ball, I would shake it, right? To say, to see what it would be. And I think everyone is going to have a different kind of take on this. But I will lead with kind of the facts of what we know, right? DoD in many cases have been putting these DFARS clauses 70, 12, 19, and 20 in contracts for many years now. So while for most CMMC does seem like a new thing, the DoD perspective, right, wrong, or whatever, right, is mainly coming from the expectation is a lot of these practices have already been in place, right? We're now just validating and certifying them. So with that being said, I do think there is an expectation that most, and especially those most critical manufacturers or that have been identified as having the most sensitive information, are gaining compliance or at least close to aligning within the next few years. It is a new, process. It's a new, all of us are learning, at the C3PAOs, just like the OSCs, things are changing and evolving for us in terms of how we're responding and complying with DoD requirements. So I do think there's going to be, in instances and in every situation, there will be exceptions and maybe allowances. But I do think the idea is that most are gaining or at least close to getting some sort of compliance within the time frame, right? Now, there's different folks that have different ideas of when those 3 years start or when those timings start. So that's still, could be a guess. But I don't see DoD much rolling back from kind of their phased kind of requirements that they put out.
Yeah, would agree. I think every indication we're seeing is that the program is in effect, but as you said, right, it's going to be phased in. There'll be some learning. There'll be learnings as we go along, and the system is actually built for that. So I think, but we will move forward.
Right.
Okay. So and Amy, you spoke about this during your talk about making sure you have that evidence. So does a prime contractor need to have or make available their supplier's CMMC assessment artifacts as evidence to support that compliance mandate?
Yeah, so I'll jump in here kind of what we've seen first around this. I think this is largely going to depend, right, on where and how that prime contractor is using that supplier in their data flow, what they determine or what is necessary to support the prime contractor's compliance efforts. So for example, most primes of what we're seeing have been for their main kind of supplier. So think about, you are supporting a big aerospace engineering company, and maybe you supply or you manufacture the wings, right, for that plane. Okay, so you're a major part of their delivery process. Most primes are just telling that supplier, get a certification, right? Like, we don't want to have to go through the process of we prime don't want to own the process of looking at your SSP and looking at your POEM and looking at your procedures. We want you to get externally validated by an independent third party so we can say we rely on them because they have already passed and met the certification requirements. So it's gonna very much come down to, all of this depends on relationships and risk profile to the organization that you're contracted with.
Right. I also will point out that, like, when that one of the steps your C3PA organization is going to do as part of your certification is they're going to take the results of their assessments and enter them into the EMAS system. So there is going to be a record of the CMMC compliance, of each company in kind of that centralized database. So, I think that'll be the first place they go for that, will be, as that checkbox, if you will. Okay, so Number 3. So we get this question quite a bit. All this question about, okay, what's marked as CUI or not CUI, what's considered CUI, et cetera. So kind of Kia, your take. So are the designs we make using CUI we are sent, are those all, should we also mark those as CUI?
Yeah, again, like so many things, this is going to heavily depend, right, on what is sent to you and what is being communicated to you all in the delivery of your contract. 9 times out of 10, what I have seen and what we have seen, using CUI to then create a product of something that is specific to the delivery of the services does often transform that product into CUI itself, right? So it will really depend. But one thing to keep in mind is when you think about the idea of commingling information, if you have to receive CUI into, let's say, a tool to then use that CUI to build something in the same said tool, now the entire tool is a CUI asset, right? So oftentimes by default, because you're commingling the CUI you've received and transforming and creating something else, the product does often become CUI, but that is going to be another one that is not going to be a one size fits all answer. It's always CUI. There's always can be exceptions to the rule.
Great. So reading these ahead, I am actually not sure we can ever answer number 5. So, but
yep.
But on number 4, so if I come across one of my subcontractors that doesn't meet a particular requirement, what happens?
That is a Pandora's box
Yeah,
of all
exactly.
kind of possibilities and things to do. So it always goes back to that very first step, right? You've got to understand where your CUI is going, who it's going to, and what are they doing with it, right? If there is a subcontractor who, let's say, maybe have the ability to have your CUI, but they don't really need to have it, you found a way, or they're not doing anything with it, and you find out they don't meet the flow down requirements, right? A simple fix could just be stop sending them CUI, figure out a way to take them out of the boundary, right? However, if that subcontractor is getting that CUI and they are providing, an essential process, so they're really providing something that is doing things for you to be able to deliver that service, they're likely falling into that CUI asset category, which is open for or applicable to all of the CMMC requirements. So at that point, you've got to figure out either how that subcontractor will start to be compliant, or what is the path for them, or maybe even finding a new subcontractor. So there's really not a lot of, I get a lot of times from clients will say, well, if I do these 5 compensating things, is that okay for them not meeting it? And the short answer is there's not really a that's okay kind of caveat or dictionary of terms to say, if you don't do these 3 things, you have these 5 exceptions you can lean on a lot of times. You really just kind of have to meet the requirements. But understanding your boundary and making sure that your boundary is only as big as those contractors and assets that you need it to be is usually the first step of getting some of those non-compliant subcontractors even out of scope.
Great. Well, thanks so much for that. As I said, so I apologize for putting 5 on here to everybody, including the audience, because it's just something we can't answer.
Yeah.
So everyone, so Kia, Amy, thanks so much for your time and for your time today, and taking the time out of your busy schedules to talk to everyone. Audience, thanks for attending today. Hopefully you enjoyed the discussion. We got your questions answered. I think we answered a number of them over both chat and Q&A. So hopefully that helped everybody. So want to thank everybody for coming today, and please join us in our next webinar. We have a number of these each month, and we'll be happy to see you in the future. Thanks so much.